Hello and welcome to Grow Conversations, your window into the world of medical cannabis here in the United Kingdom. My name's Alex Fraser, I'm Patient Access Lead at Grow Pharma, and on today's episode, my guest is Melissa Sturgess. Melissa is CEO at Ananda Corp. Is that right? It's Ananda Corporation?
Developments.
Ananda Developments, sorry.
Nearly,
my mistake.
close enough.
Well, thank you for joining me here today. We're here in the lovely Soho studios. It's a first for me. So I'm very intrigued to see what this episode is going to come out like, but also very intrigued to speak to you about the work that you're doing with Ananda. I think the first thing to say perhaps is it's not the sort of work that we're doing with Grow, is it? It's you're looking more at the world of trials versus, I suppose, the more prescription access sort of work that we do as Grow Pharma.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how Ananda was conceived and where that came from.
Yeah. Thanks. Great to be here. And thank you for having me. We started Ananda back a long time ago, 2018, and started very much with the unlicensed idea of medical cannabis and cultivating flower and extraction of oils. And then we reached the half conclusion, part decision, that really what mattered to us was getting access for patients in the UK on the NHS to cannabis-based medicines. And so then that naturally took us down the path of, well, what do we need to do to get NHS acceptance? And that means NICE guidelines. So then that means MHRA. And so that means randomised controlled clinical trials. And so that's where we're at. So it wasn't initially obvious to us that that's what we needed to do, because I suppose we'd looked at what had been going on elsewhere in the world and we'd seen medical cannabis becoming more and more accepted and more widely prescribed. And I think we weren't alone, grappled with, well, why aren't we seeing patient numbers increase in the UK as we have in other jurisdictions? And our conclusion has been because we have the NHS.
Yep.
And so then we said, well, medical cannabis needs to be available to everyone who needs it, not just those who can afford it. And so here we are, into pharmaceutical land and clinical trials.
Yeah, it's like I say, a world's above and beyond, it feels, than the market access work, like I say, what we're doing. At this point in time, we have somewhere between 30 and 40,000 patients with prescriptions in the UK, and that is, when you think about the plethora of applications for medicines derived from cannabis, that doesn't seem to be scratching the surface. And we're nearly 6 years on. So certainly there's a question to be asked about other routes. You've mentioned a few things there that I'd like you just to explain for our audience, because technical terms and what have you. So NICE guidelines, MHRA and RCTs. It's a lot of mouthfuls. Maybe we can skip MHRA. MHRA, the medicines regulator in the UK. That's fairly straightforward. But NICE guidelines, I think, would be really important to understand, and they lead into why you're doing RCTs. So maybe we can talk to those as well.
Yeah.
And exactly what.
So NICE guidelines are the roadmap that a clinician would have for prescribing a medicine that would then be available on the NHS. So most clinicians, whether they're GPs or specialists, will have a patient who has an indication or a condition, and they will look to the NICE guidelines to see how they should handle or treat that patient. And so that's a key part of what we're trying to achieve, is conduct randomised controlled clinical trials with formulations, with CBD-based formulations, and have NICE recommend those formulations for prescribing under certain conditions. So that's the role of NICE. Then, of course, you've got the regulator, the Medicines Health Regulatory Agency. So for them to license a medicine so that actually we can make claims that that a medicine can be used to treat particular indications, we need to get their approval. And then we've obviously got the NHS, which is the place where we can all go to obtain our medicines either free or at reduced rates. And so for us, getting our heads around all of that has been really crucial, because we think that is the door. That's the door for medical cannabis. We've got to get through that door.
Yes, it's the door for medicines in this country. I think that's important to understand. Is it, if you're, I suppose, from a patient point of view, you go to your GP as the gateway to more options for whatever you're trying to treat. That GP, like you say, has essentially a pathway. First, I try this drug, then maybe this one. Might refer to a specialist. That specialist will then do this drug or this treatment or a surgery or something else. And what you're saying is, through building the evidence base, through these randomized controlled trials, we're trying to put cannabis medicines into that pathway.
Yeah.
And as it stands as an unlicensed medicine, if they're in the pathway at all, they're at the very, very end. And that's if they're in the pathway.
Yeah.
Certainly from an NHS GP point of view, probably not aware that it is another option on there. So let's delve into RCTs a little bit. I think, again, I'm going to talk a lot from the patient point of view. You'll have to forgive me, but it's these are the questions I'm going to be... well, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's a good point. The criticism, I suppose, is how long is that going to take? What's that going to cost? What are the practicalities for you as a business looking at RCTs? You were looking at unlicensed and then you changed tack towards this RCT route.
Yeah.
What then happened, cogs turning in the business that meant, right, we've got to do this, we've got to do that? How do you get to launching an RCT in the medical cannabis space?
Yeah.
I suppose that's the question.
Especially when you've never done it before.
Well, yes, and very few have. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
There's very few companies that have done this at all. So, yeah, really pioneering work.
I think the fact that the founding team of Ananda didn't come from the pharmaceutical space, I think actually has been an advantage, because we haven't seen the barriers that a pharmaceutical group would necessarily see. So we've been a little bit naive, and I think that's been to our advantage. So where we started was in 2019, NICE completed a report on the evidence for medical cannabis in the UK. Mm-hmm. And that report was very extensive. And I think I have not seen anything like it anywhere else in the world. Mm. And they called for more research. They said, okay, we can see that there's a bit of a case here, but we really need to see more clinical evidence, and we need to see, very importantly, health economics around these drugs. And of course, the NHS, and some of this stuff, it's like, yeah, okay, that's really obvious, but the NHS needs to be able to prescribe these medicines for anyone in the UK who needs them. So that's nearly 80 million people. Mm. So health economics are as important as the clinical efficacy of a medicine that can be widely available on the NHS. And that doesn't only mean us saying, yes, we know it works. We have to prove that it works, and we have to prove that costs will come down in other areas. And that's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time. Mm. But going back to your question, how do we how do we go about that? So we started with that document and said, well, okay, we've been asked for more research in particular indications. We also, because of the work we'd done in the unlicensed space, we had started to engage with some clinicians at Edinburgh University who had been involved in some of the early work that GW Pharmaceuticals had done. So there was already they were receptive to the idea of cannabis-based medicines and CBD-based medicines particularly. And that's really where we started, was with a pain indication, chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, and a professor by the name of Professor Mari Fallon at Edinburgh University. And we started talking to her, and she said she would like to conduct a clinical trial. She believed she could get funding for the trial, and would we provide the formulation for it? And so we said, obviously, yes. And what we have done is create formulations. So they're our own unique CBD-based formulations. They are patent pending, so we have intellectual property around them, which that ticks the IP commercial box for us as a business. Yeah. But it also means that she has access to a medicine that meets all the MHRA requirements for an acronym, IMP, an investigative medical product. Yeah, possibly. Yeah. So we engaged with her. So a little bit, as with any entrepreneurial business, a little bit opportunistic at the beginning, or quite a lot opportunistic. So I think some really good ideas, some naivety, some pretty good background in entrepreneurship and problem solving and creativity, and then some really good luck and fortune coming across some clinicians who are interested. And then so engaging with Professor Fallon then led to engagement with the endometriosis team up at Edinburgh University, who also, and this is not going to be anything new for your listeners or your patient groups, that we all know that CBD cannabis can help endometriosis pain and other symptoms associated with endometriosis. So the clinician team at Edinburgh University were obviously getting that feedback from their patients and saying, well, we would like to be able to prescribe something as well. So can we please do a clinical trial, and do you have a formulation? So we met them via Professor Fallon, and that's what instigated the clinical trial that we're working towards in endo, shorthand endo. And endometriosis is an absolutely standout target for a CBD-based formulation.
What makes it a standout target?
Because CBD, the endocannabinoid system is very highly integrated with the hormonal system and the reproductive system in a woman. And also, it doesn't only interact with, well, actually, I won't get into a lot of the more specialist pharmaco side of the mechanisms of action of CBD around CBD1 and CB2 receptors, the cannabinoid receptors, but it also does influence other inflammatory pathways. So a lot of the inflammatory pathways that CBD acts on are also involved in endometriosis. So we believe, this is not proven yet, but with clinical trials, but we believe we can see some downregulation of some of these other inflammatory pathways, and we think that that is what's going to come out of all these clinical trials that we do. And this is just the beginning. And yes, it takes time, and yes, it takes money, but until we start, we don't finish.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about money just for a moment. It's the crux of all of this, I think, at the end of the day. We're businesses, pharmaceutical companies operating in this space. So money is always on the table. It's always a question of consideration. You mentioned IP earlier. That is often touted as one of the key reasons why there's such little clinical research happening in this space. Could you explain to our listeners quite what that means when we say, intellectual property is what we mean in IP, but what do we mean in terms of cannabis, and how does that impact pharmaceutical research?
Well, usually in pharmaceutical research, when you're developing drugs, you would have some IP because you'd invent a molecule, or you'd do something to a molecule that made it your very own. And no one can do that to CBD, for example, because it already exists. However, everyone seems to overlook the fact that GW Pharmaceuticals, over a long period of time and with a lot of money, managed to conduct randomized controlled trials, placebo-controlled, and they developed drugs, and they license the drugs, and they have patents over their formulations, and they were then sold to Jazz for $7.5 billion or whatever. So I don't quite understand where that argument comes from, because if you have a license for your drug, and we've also applied for patents, so we have patents pending over our CBD formulations and the methodology for formulating those drugs.
Okay.
So we believe there is a way, and we're doing that, to capture the intellectual property. But that's sort of the key argument is, well, you're not inventing anything new. And I think that's why we're seeing some of the early stage R&D where companies are looking at doing something to the molecule to increase bioavailability, or change the delivery method,
lipid fats, and
whatever.
I won't ask you to spill the secret sauce on that, but certainly it's fascinating to hear that. What I hear from the 99% of the industry, that this is a barrier, an IP, this is something we can't patent, and therefore, why invest in trials? Not a problem for Ananda. Fantastic if we can get proof of concept of that. I mean, and arguably you're saying we have that with GW.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why should others not be doing this work? There's also a lot of cost involved in randomized controlled trials. So I suppose it's a game, isn't it, of convincing investors, convincing those to fund these trials. Do you get any support from any government funds, anything else like that towards your trials?
Yeah, so we're a publicly listed company, so we trade on the Junior Stock Exchange.
So no private investors, or not so much anymore.
Yeah, so we have so individual and institutional investors can buy our shares on the stock market, and when we raise money from time to time, they can participate and invest in us when we raise money from time to time. But there is money available from the government as well. For example, the endometriosis trial is being funded by the Scottish NHS. So it's the Chief Scientist's Office. They've put up £300,000 to conduct the trial. So our modus operandi, if you like, our preferred modus operandi at the moment is that we find clinician investigators who are world leaders in their field. Example, endometriosis, Dr. Lucy Whittaker, Professor Andrew Horn, Professor Philippa Saunders. They are the global leaders in endometriosis research. So you get the top guys and girls. And use our formulation and government grants. And I think if you put together a really, really credible team, as we have done with these 2 trials, then the funding is there from the government. Now, the government, the NHS, will fund the trial work, but we then have to fund, and it's in our, well, we want to fund the licensing part because we want the commercial part of that deal. So whilst the Chief Scientist's Office in Scotland will fund the actual clinical trial, we provide our formulation for free. So it's our formulation that is in the double-blind, the randomised controlled trial, and then we retain the option to commercialise the results of that trial. So it's our job then to engage with the MHRA for licensing and to engage with NICE to get the NICE recommendations. And it's only through doing that that we can then crack the NHS, And to your point, that everyone says, well, it's not worth doing or it can't be done. Well, it can be done, and you know what? It should be done.
Yes. That's more importantly, really.
Yeah. So, yes, we are very commercially driven, of course. We have shareholders. I speak to our shareholders every day. I have a group, and this is one of my little sort of on my bandwagons. I have a group of male shareholders, all private investors, and I get messages from them at 10, 11 o'clock on a Saturday night sending me latest research on endometriosis here's a research paper out of Brazil. Here's a new, have you seen this trial, Melissa, out of whatever? Oh, someone in our little WhatsApp group chat has asked a question about the trial in Scotland. These are individual males saying, this research needs to happen. We're putting money into Ananda. They're shareholders in this company. They are on at me all the time. Keep going. This is really good. You need to do it. This is a game changer. Women shouldn't suffer this much. And it's men. And one of my little bandwagon points is, where are the women investors? So I sort of would love to see more women investing in this space. I mean, this has got to be the biggest opportunity for impact investing for any woman I could ever meet, is you can do good and make money, potentially make money. It's obviously, this is a high-risk space we're in. But, it's a very, very exciting proposition that we could potentially lead the world in changing the way endometriosis is treated. And we can do that in this country. So why wouldn't we do it? And, of course, it's hard, but, let's get on with it.
Yeah. Brilliant. I mean, it's so reassuring to hear that you have investors, particularly that demographic that are, I was going to use the word invested, but emotionally invested, and passionate about the work that you're doing too. It's fantastic. Let's talk about that licensing. So let's say you have a drug, you've proven that it's effective in managing. Is it managing pain particularly in endometriosis, or is it managing the condition? Yeah,
so that's a really good question. So the trial that we're doing it's a phase 2 trial, so it's in women who have endometriosis.
Yep.
And it is a pilot study to look at a wider UK-wide study later. And yes, it is in looking at managing pain. We believe that there is more to the potential for CBD in the treatment of endometriosis, but this study is particularly on pain. So yes.
Okay. Let's say we've got to that point. We have a medicine. We've shown that it's effective for pain and endometriosis. How do you then get that onto the NHS? Is it very straightforward? You say, look, here's the trial data. That's the job done. Let's put it in. How then, I suppose, does it get? We mentioned the pathway earlier.
Yeah.
Where does it fit? How do you determine where that's going to fit?
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit about how that works?
Yeah. So some of it happens in parallel. Some of it has to happen in sequence. So you have a protocol for a randomised controlled trial, and endometriosis is phase 2, and we expect that we probably have to do another phase 3. So that would mean more patients over a larger demographic, a larger area, a physical area. But essentially, the protocol or the process for trials and then regulation and licensing is, yes, randomised controlled trials. We talk about measuring endpoints, so it's what actually is going to be measured. And when I say measured, it's not I just feel better. It's got to be scored and it's got to be measured using some kind of a tool that is recognised by the licensing authority. So it's making sure at the very beginning of the trial that all of the questions you're going to ask and all of the measurements you're going to take are going to be meaningful to the MHRA when you come to have that licensing conversation. So very early on in the trial process or in the protocol development process, we start to engage with regulatory advisory bodies. So there's a whole industry that I've learned about, which is advising us on how we make sure the trial will answer the right questions in the right way and get the right answers so that the regulator says, this makes sense. Then there's another layer, which is, okay, you can get a licensed medicine, but what we want is NICE saying, we recommend it. We want a doctor to be able to go online and say, I have a patient presenting with endometriosis. What is the treatment pathway? And it's very clear. NICE is unbelievable. You and I can go online. You dial up endometriosis, do it, and it'll tell you what you do with this patient. If this, then that. If this, then that. As we know, endometriosis hugely takes 8 to 10 years to be diagnosed. The only formal diagnosis is actually, I'm not even going to say the word, it's invasive.
Sure.
So they actually go into the woman's uterus. I won't say uterus or womb, stomach. We need to get one of the experts on here, one of the women who suffer.
We'll do that.
Yeah. Actually, that would be really cool.
Later on, perhaps when we have some updates about the trial as well, perhaps maybe even a participant. I mean, this might be some time down the way, but
yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. So we need to make sure that what we do also is going to make sense to NICE, so that when NICE look at the trial and the licensing, they say, okay, so when these women were taking CBD, their healthcare costs dropped, or they didn't take these other drugs. And so they can see then the really strong economic case for that particular drug. So it's in parallel and it's in series, and there's a lot of work, but there are also lots of people who can help with this. So we don't have to have that expertise in-house. We can bring that in. So there are groups that specialise in this. And the great thing is, at the end of the day, you've got the NHS.
Yes.
And that's sort of, that's seared into the minds of everyone who works for Ananda, which is, this is about the NHS. This is not about who can afford it. This is about who needs it and who has the right to receive it.
Yeah, exactly that. It's I suppose if it sounds like I'm going to be defensive about the sort of market access, the private, the unlicensed prescription side. But you mentioned earlier you've got the nurses or healthcare professionals in hospitals with seeing these benefits from their endometriosis patients, and I suppose that's increasing because there's private unlicensed prescriptions happening, emboldening patients to be vocal about this, particularly with clinicians.
Yeah.
You inspire enough clinicians at the right level in the right places, and then you need someone like Ananda to come in and find those people, put a trial together and make it all make sense to the NHS and the MHRA. I've tried to sum it up in the simplest way possible, but it's a very complicated thing to be engaged in. Yeah. What are the timeframes involved here? Has the trial launched, the endometriosis trial? When is it due to launch?
Yeah, hopefully later this year they'll start recruiting.
Okay.
So the work we're doing at the moment has been putting together all of the documents that will make the regulator happy. And there's a lot of work and a lot of documents, and whoever knew. I now knew. We learn something every day, and we proceed very, very carefully with the guidance of a lot of really smart people. So I'm reluctant to put timelines on these trials because we're a publicly listed company.
Sure.
It's sort of, what you tend to find is you hang yourself because you make a prediction and then it doesn't come true. What I can say is we understand the pathway. We know what we have to do, and we are resourced to do it, and we're determined to do it. So we just have to start. And I think your point is really valid that many, many, many clinicians we speak to, doctors we speak to, they all understand and recognize that there is a huge amount of real world evidence out there. And our job is to sort of take that energy and enthusiasm and run in parallel to the work that you guys are doing. You know, you're prescribing on the ground to real patients who have needs right now, and you're able to meet those needs. And we're not in competition with anything you guys are doing. We're playing I suppose that, it is a slightly longer game.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, it means we have a mainstream medicine. Yeah.
This is it. I think if anything, I suppose the point I was trying to make is they complement each other. I think the work that you're doing you're right, it's the long game, it's the NHS. I've often said, and people will quote it back at me if I don't highlight it, that my personal end goal as an advocate, going way back before I worked for Grow, was, these medicines on the NHS. So it's hugely reassuring to hear that work is happening, and that and clearly you know what you're talking about, and that you believe that it's possible. I'd like to understand a bit more about yourself and your background, if that's all right. You mentioned earlier that your team are not from the world of pharmaceuticals. What world are you from, Melissa?
Metals and mining. So I'm one of those terrible people who came to this space out of commodities, really.
Sure.
So most of my career has been sort of corporate finance based and putting together deals mainly on the African continent. So I spent sort of 20 years running around Africa, finding projects in various commodities. So I've worked in gold, precious stones. So I've done diamonds, tanzanite, fluorspar. So I've done industrial minerals, coal, platinum. So, most of my career in that part of the world. And so I suppose what I think that taught me, amongst many other things, was that we have to listen really carefully to what the regulations and what the government is telling us and asking for. So I learned that very early on in my career. An example was, and I talk about this example quite often, that I actually took a position in a company that had a license to prospect for gold and to mine gold in Zambia. And the previous management had lost the license, so the government had taken the license away. And I thought I could get the license back, so I went and parked myself in Lusaka for 3 or 4 months and had continuous meetings with the Minister of Mines and the President of the time, Rapai Banda. And it really struck me then that what I needed to do was listen to them, and they were telling me what I needed to do to get that license back. And so I think I learned in that space that I don't think about this in terms of rights. Think about this in terms of that the gift, that these are in the gift of the government, and we have to listen to the regulator, we have to listen to the government and do what they are asking us to do. And if we do that, we will get where we need to get to. So anytime we start to think differently within our team, we go, okay, let's go back to what did the government ask for? What does the NICE report say? What research have they asked for? And we just keep coming back to that. And it's a really, really simple ask that they made.
Yeah.
So my background was metals and mining, corporate finance, and capital markets.
Yeah.
And crazily, in 2017, the commodity cycle was at a real low. And I was completely opportunistically looking around thinking, I wonder what's going on. What are other areas that I might do a deal in? And I saw what was happening in capital markets in Canada, and then it happened in Australia where small companies had grown massively. And I thought, that looks interesting and fun. Started to look into it, and Ananda was created, and sort of, the rest, as they say, is history. But it really was opportunistic. So I don't come from a pharma background. I don't come from an advocacy background. I came from, how do we solve the problem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're a problem solving. I was going to ask, did you solve the problem in it was Zambia?
Yeah, I did.
Yes, you did.
Yeah,
You got the license
Of
back.
course.
Well,
Of course.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Of course. No, I just
Thank you.
wanted to round off that just to make sure we,
Yeah.
to prove the point, I guess, that we do need to. And it's really interesting. And I suppose what's going through my mind as you're talking about that, engaging with the regulators, engaging with the systems that we have. We had that law change in 2018 that enables the unlicensed market and spurred a lot of interest in this space. On the back of patient-led campaigns. And I think there's a very large cohort, a very loud cohort of patients. I also think including the parents, particularly those of epileptic children, who are continuing down that line of campaigning and hoping that by making, demands in the media, highlighting, the strife that this is going to change. And I think it's the harsh reality that we have a system of regulations so that media campaigns cannot infiltrate the NHS, so that pharma companies cannot fund campaigns. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying this is why those things exist. That there's a barrier there for a reason, and the work that you're doing has to be done to overcome that barrier. And I guess no matter how loud we shout, and no matter what the injustice, that barrier exists particularly for that reason. That's something that I think is really important to clarify. Is that something you'd agree that's, I suppose it's the unlicensed world, it's not necessarily something that you see day to day, or do you, I suppose? Do you hear much from that patient advocacy cohort?
I stay close to it, I believe.
Sure.
I believe I stay close to it because it is part of the area in which we operate. To your point, I see that it is the government's job to change the law to make, which they did, to change the scheduling of cannabis. And then it's up to industry to do the work to provide the medicines. And then it's up to the NHS and NICE and the MHRA to regulate that space. You never say never, but I don't see a point in time where the government will start telling doctors what they need to look at to treat a patient. So
it's just not their place.
It just doesn't, and it doesn't just, yes, it does. It's not their place, and it doesn't work like that. And that then becomes the thin end of the wedge. It becomes, well, if cannabis, then what about another drug or whatever? And I don't see that happening. I think the government is saying very clearly now, we changed the law. The scheduling allows the R&D to be done much more easily than it ever was before. So go and do the work,
Yep.
And I think it's unfortunate that more of us haven't got on and done the work, because it is there to be done. It can be done. It can make money for shareholders. We know that. We have the best worked example I need, which is GW Pharmaceuticals was sold for $7.5 billion. If you want to just put your hardcore commercial hat on, you can look at that and say, well, there's a worked example. We only need N equals 1. As we know in real world evidence, we only need N equals 1. So there's your N equals 1.
Yeah.
So there's your commercial imperative. Now let's crack on. Answer the question. Look at the rules and the regulations. Go and do the work.
So I suppose to play devil's advocate, I'm not a multiple sclerosis, but let's say I'm a multiple sclerosis patient. If I'm in certain parts of the UK, Sativex, the GW product is still, despite being licensed for spasticity and MS, not available or not funded. So, what would be your counterpoint to that? What are you going to do differently to ensure that when you're licensing a medicine, it's not that sort of semi-accessibility that we have with a Sativex? I'm not sure whether it's quite so restrictive with Epidiolex, the other drug they've produced, but I'm aware from talking to MS patients that the phrase used is postcode lottery. It depends where you are in the UK. It's not CCG now, is it? There's another word for them, but the commissioning groups who decide what medicines they'll pay for in that area won't take on Sativex. And I think it's to do with where it is in that pathway we mentioned earlier. I'm not entirely sure.
Cost, probably.
Yes.
It's probably very expensive, and so then the trust says we're not prepared to fund it. We're not comfortable with and I know nothing about the condition, but how many MS sort of nuanced conditions fit within that strict prescribing criteria. Yeah.
Yeah, true.
I don't know. I don't know how that bit works. What I do know is that when you say things like that, and when I speak and I watch, as we all do, the stories of children with epilepsy, then it makes me more determined to get this right. When I see the stories of women suffering from endometriosis, then it just makes me work harder and longer, and we just have to get on with it, and we just have to just keep pushing, because I have no doubt we can get there. So we've got to get on with it, and we have to just keep doing what we know they want us to do, which is tick those regulatory boxes.
Exactly that. So I suppose if it is cost that is the reason why the GW medicines aren't accessible, is that something that you're very aware of when you're producing the medicines?
Yes.
Yeah, great. That's reassuring.
Well, yes, and that then you also then have a conversation with the NHS about that. You know, the NHS, they have their own view about what medicines should cost as well. So yeah, that's a negotiation. Yeah.
What does that look like? I suppose it's a case by case, but what do the NHS say on that? I suppose it's got to be as cheap as possible, isn't it? It's got to be competitive with other medicines for that.
Yeah, symptom. So that will come into the health economics analysis. We will demonstrate where we sit in terms of cost effectiveness, where that sits relative to other medicines. And just going back to the team. So we are...
I'd love to hear more about the team.
Yeah. So we are the founding team are not pharmaceutical. We're not a pharmaceutical team. So we've got metals and mining, and we've got oil and gas.
Okay.
And we've got then the younger members of our team. One comes out of a more pharmaceutical environment, but one comes out of government policy, and the other one also comes out of metals and mining. So quite, good open thinking individuals, really skilled, really talented, high functioning team. And now we're surrounding ourselves with the real experts. So Professor Clive Page at King's has joined the board. He's an inflammation specialist. And so that is absolutely in the sweet spot of what we believe we can achieve with CBD. And he started a company called Verona Pharmaceuticals, which is now NASDAQ quoted and worth billions. Wow. So he knows his stuff, both from a commercial perspective, a building value perspective, and a regulatory perspective, and a clinical trials perspective. So he's sort of, guru number one go-to. And Professor Trevor Jones has just joined the board as well.
Wonderful.
He was head of R&D at Wellcome Trust. So he has developed drugs all the way through in the days when an head of R&D actually took the drug right through development, not just focused on the R bit.
And I've met Trevor. He's such a wealth of... Sorry to interrupt. Of knowledge and information. Please do carry on. Sorry.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
If you ever need inspiration about why you just keep going, you go and have coffee with Trevor.
Yeah, great story. I should get him on the podcast, actually. Maybe I should do that.
You should. He'd be fantastic. And the pathway through to licensing, he's just all over it. So he's just, rips apart our Gantt charts, advises the team, super engaged.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we've got Professor Murray Fallon and Professor Andrew Horn now and Dr. Lucy Whitaker. So as we're building, we're now bringing in the hardcore pharma people, but we mustn't lose sight yet. And I say yet because you've got to keep a watching brief on these things. If you're building a business, at some point, it becomes a proper pharmaceutical company. We're keeping a watching brief on making sure we retain the drive and the innovation, along with keeping all those pharma credentials really, really close. And I think we've got a really cool balance on that at the moment. And because we've got such a wonderful, high-functioning, dynamic core team, everyone's really open to, okay, I need to talk to Clive about that. I need to talk to Trevor about that. We're going to have a call with Mari Fallon about that. So, there's no closed thinking here. And you've got to do that in medical cannabis. I think you've got to have a feel for why this drug is different, but it's not different. We're building formulations in a space that make it not different. So it'll be just available on the NHS, but we also are very attuned to the nuances, especially from a regulatory space. And also the myriad of mechanisms of action.
I was going to say that there was something I was going to touch on is we've talked about the trial in endometriosis. Can you tell us much about that drug or any of the products, I suppose, that you have in the pipeline? Is that something we can talk about?
Yeah, well, look, they're CBD-based formulations.
Sure.
And
we talking oils or?
Yeah, they'll be oils.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, oils. And the reason for that in the early stage is get into the NHS.
Yeah.
So the minute you start looking at nano formulations or different delivery systems, you then add another level of complexity to the offering and to your, the drug development, the clinical trials, and then the licensing pathway. So, of course, there will be further generations of these drugs and these formulations that we're creating, and we will look at all sorts of other areas, but let's get through that door. You know, that's like we're banging.
Yep.
We want to get through the door. Shove your foot in it, hold it open, and then lean in with a bit of shoulder. So these vast mechanisms of action. So again, I'm not a scientist, so we do know that CBD is regarded as safe. The World Health Organization says that. Mm-hmm. So therefore, these clinical trials that we're doing are phase 2. They're not preclinical in test tubes, all of that stuff. So we sort of, that box gets ticked. We know that there are some side effects potentially, but generally, I think everyone's pretty comfortable that the side effects aren't debilitating to the point where you need to start in the
where
test
you've got
tube.
a problem.
Yeah. In terms of the mechanisms, I think they're fast becoming better known, but there are a myriad of mechanisms. So unlike many drugs where you'd have one molecule, one target in the body, and you get one molecule binding to one receptor, you don't have that in CBD or cannabis. You have lots of binding going on with all sorts of different receptors throughout the body. And I think we need to look at that from two perspectives. One is that that's extraordinarily helpful where you have these complex chronic inflammatory related conditions, because there's a lot more going on when you have endometriosis, MS, Parkinson's, for example. There's a lot more going on than is going to be solved by one target, one receptor, one molecule, one receptor. So these myriad of pathways can really work to our advantage. And then we need to remember that there are some drugs that have been developed where the mechanism of action still isn't known, but they have been proven and they are prescribed. So we don't need to understand everything.
No.
We need to show that it's clinically safe, efficacious, and cost-effective. So those myriad of pathways really work to our advantage when we have these complex indications. The flip side of that is, I think, where traditional pharmaceutical people, if I were to put it that way, might say, well, that means it's snake oil because it does all of these things. And so then we end up with this sort of back-to-front story, which is a drug or a molecule chasing conditions. So we have cannabis clinics or cannabis medications, and it can help you with all of these different conditions. The conservative model, and the model that works when you look on the NICE guidelines and you go and talk to a doctor, is the doctor will say, and the NICE guidelines will say, what is the condition, and then how do you treat it? So whilst we know there are these myriad of mechanisms of action and they're all going to be we believe they're going to be really helpful, we need to stay focused on the indications, because that is the way we can speak the language of the regulator. We can't say, we've got a drug, it can do all these amazing things. We need to say, there's an indication, here's a drug, here's what's going on, here's how it helps, there's no side effects, it worked really well, it meant they came off other drugs, they didn't have to go to hospital. There's a story that hangs together clinically and from a cost-effective perspective. So I don't even remember what the question was.
No, but it's super interesting. I don't remember either, actually, to be really honest. But I mean, oh God, I could talk to you about this all day. I guess rounding off that part of the conversation, how much are you narrowing that down then in terms of the production of the medicine? It's CBD based, is that, I think, the term you've used throughout. Is there anything else in there at all? Is it CBD isolate? Is that something you're, again, I'm prying here, I'm aware you might not be too comfortable answering these questions. Again, don't want you to spill the secret sauce, but
so they are CBD based, and they have other ingredients, but the active is CBD.
Sure. Okay.
So that's really what we're focused on. But we've wrapped these patent applications around what we've done so that we can get the commercial benefit. So in terms of other formulations for other indications, we believe that the core formulation we have, which is going to be used in the chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy trial and the endometriosis trial.
Same drug.
That is the same formulation,
Gotcha.
yeah. But very specifically looking at these two indications. Because again, from a regulatory perspective, from a NICE perspective, from an NHS perspective, we're not saying just put this on the NHS and it can do everything, because the NHS goes, okay, well, what's my budget for drugs for the year?
Yeah.
Do I just say, okay, any patient who's got anything might need CBD? What's that going to cost? No, that's not how it works. How it works is there's a budget, and we have to be able to say, for this indication, it's currently costing the NHS, the taxpayers in the UK, Y. And by adding our formulation to that treatment methodology, here's what can happen to the health economics for the NHS around that indication. So that is one of the reasons we're really focused on looking at this from an indication perspective, is because that, again, we believe that is the way through this door of the NHS.
That's really interesting. There's some that would talk to, you could do cost comparisons of overall care. So I'm referring to conversations I've had with parents of epileptic children about how we might capture data. And I suppose they talk about cost comparisons with, because they're obviously using these medicines and reducing seizures, they're not using as many ambulances or having as much time in hospital. Is that sort of broader picture being taken into account with the NHS, do you think? Is that something that could be done in a more holistic way? Because that's ultimately the criticism that's being made here is, okay, these might cost more than other anti-epileptic drugs, they might cost more than other endometriosis pain treatments, but what is the outcome in terms of quality of life, in terms of usage of other services for those patients? Is that something that's being assessed, and is enough happening in that way? Yes,
it's a core part of what we're doing at the beginning of these trials to ensure that we ask the right question in the right way and measure it accurately and in a way that the regulator will then say, okay, we recognise that measurement. We're going to measure in centimetres. And if it started off at 10 centimetres, or it's probably a good way to describe it, because then it's not describing anything that anyone can relate to. So if it started off at 10 centimetres and you cut it off and it's now 5 centimetres, then we recognise that measurement. So that's a key part of this early work that we're doing, is making sure we ask the right question in the right way and measure it in the right way, so that the regulator, when they look at our work, says, okay, we accept that number. Not, well, that's a bit woolly.
Yeah, this is the problem, isn't it? Ultimately, that a lot of that stuff is a bit woolly until you are very clearly defining it and giving case studies, and not even case studies, but you'd have to do extensive real-world evidence to show the cost, for example, of a cohort of paediatric epilepsy patients or endometriosis patients. So it's really difficult. There's a huge amount of appreciation for the frustration, of course, of those parents, of course, of other patients in the UK. On the other hand, it's fantastic to hear that this work is being done. I think, again, a criticism that happens a lot of the industry generally, or the medical cannabis industry, is that there's not enough invested in clinical trials. There's not enough investment from big pharmaceutical companies, I think, is a criticism too. Do you think there's a wariness from pharmaceuticals? Big pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, Ananda are not one. Somewhat aiming to be one. Yes. Yet. Don't want to discredit your work. By all means, doing the work of a big pharma company, but as you've mentioned, not from that world. I'm aware there are trials going on with other big pharma companies, often with biosimilars or synthetic cannabinoids, essentially. Do you think there's a resistance to using plant-derived medicines from the big pharma world? Is that something you witness in your work?
I don't have a strong view. The one view I do have comes from my experience in metals and mining, and that is that the large companies will always watch what the small companies are doing, and if they think they're really onto something, then they'll come and play. And
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
So I would say your point about intellectual property is maybe in the mind somewhere, but I don't really understand that because GW was so successful in their drug development.
Yep.
What I did learn in metals and mining again was that quite often a large company will say, we're quite happy to allow you as the small company to create all that initial commercial value. And we don't mind paying an absolute premium for it when it's de-risked.
Yeah.
So when you've done your clinical trial and you've got the results, then we're going to...
Jazz Pharmaceuticals. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. When you've proven it. So it depends what the appetite for risk is, how much of an R&D budget these companies have. Certainly in big mining companies, usually the R&D side of life is actually quite a low risk venture. So I did a deal in India many years ago with BHP Billiton, and we had a very bullish exploration program on some ground we had in India, and BHP came in and funded part of the project, and their exploration team was way more conservative than our exploration team in their objectives, because as an R&D team, an exploration team, they were interested in creating data, developing data, logging data that would then help their case for their budget again next year. Whereas we're here to win.
Yeah, they're thinking in a much bigger sort of scale of things. It's all
and
kind of
they've got
a bit of a
more
game.
time, but less risk. You know, where we are, this has to happen, and it has to happen now, and we need to find a way through it. You know, through it. As Churchill said, if you're going through hell, keep going. And every day I look at the parents, especially the epilepsy parents, the parents of epileptic children, and I know it's sort of, we've chosen a different path. So the only way I can help, or the best way I can help, is to double down and go hard on our work, because it needs to be done, and there's a whole advocacy space out there, or industry out there, or group of individuals out there doing that work very finely. So we'll get on with our work.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for being with me here, Melissa, and explaining all of this very complicated, very in-depth, wonderful work that you're doing. It's hugely appreciated. Certainly, we will keep in touch, and like I said, we'll hopefully come back and do an episode later down the line when these trials are underway, or perhaps we even have some results from them. We don't know exactly when that will be, but hopefully very soon.
I'll keep you posted.
Please do. And thank you everyone for watching. This has been Grow Conversations, and we'll see you next time.